out. I need to check the baby now. I need the gorgeous that you leave that Cardi her.
You won't be going near her.
I had never expected a Saturday morning to feel like a battlefield. Yet there I was, gripping my newborn against my chest, while Veronica Kemp's shadow loomed over our driveway, her heels clicking with calculated authority. "That infant cannot remain on community property unsupervised," she said, voice sharp, clipboard held like a weapon. Her words weren't suggestions. They were commands, backed by a self-appointed authority that carried no legal weight, yet demanded obedience. The neighbors had started to gather at the edges of their lawns, drawn by the tension that radiated across the cul-de-sac, whispering in disbelief at the audacity of the enforcer in crimson. I didn't flinch, though the situation demanded it. "You're mistaken," I said, steady but firm, letting my tone carry the weight of truth. "That rule doesn't exist in our bylaws, and you know it." The clipboard queen's lips tightened, and for a moment, the confident mask flickered, revealing irritation. She took a step closer, ignoring the small cluster of onlookers now straining for a better view. Her hand reached toward the stroller, and in that instant, my pulse accelerated, not out of fear, but instinct. The last time someone underestimated who I was, consequences had been severe. "Hands off," I warned, voice quiet but resolute, the kind of warning a firefighter gives when seconds can mean the difference between life and chaos. If you've ever felt that surge of responsibility when someone threatens the people you love, then you'll understand the knot in my stomach. So hit the subscribe button now, and why I knew I had to act, methodically, not recklessly. This wasn't about confrontation. It was about proving that authority rooted in intimidation holds no ground against preparation, skill, and observation. The block itself, with its manicured hedges and uniform fences, felt suddenly oppressive, a stage for the showdown that had quietly been building under the pretense of HOA management. I introduced myself in calm, measured words, though internally my mind cataloged every detail. The angle of the sun casting shadows across the sidewalk, the slight hum of the neighbor's lawnmower blending with distant car engines, the stroller's subtle sway in my grip. "I'm the father," I said. "I'm trained to assess risk, respond to threats, and protect what matters." Her gaze narrowed, the tyrant in heels now visibly reconsidering the ease of her intimidation. I could see the calculation behind those eyes, the officer of rules evaluating whether her scripted power could overcome my unspoken resolve. The stakes weren't abstract. My daughter's safety hung in the balance, but so did the precedent this small, overreaching enforcement could set. If the board chair could physically assert authority over an infant with no legal basis, every family in the neighborhood could be subject to arbitrary rule. This was why the fight had to start here, now, even if it began with nothing more than verbal fortitude and the unyielding shield of law on my side. And then the small details began to crystallize. The misplaced cones that framed the HOA's claimed boundaries, the unusual arrangement of security cameras angled for intimidation rather than oversight, the faint ripple in the air as if the cul-de-sac itself was holding its breath. Every element screamed mismanagement, a veneer of control designed to intimidate, and I realized how little the board chair understood about accountability. A quick mental map of the possible outcomes formed, each linked to a careful, calculated response. My daughter's safety, the neighborhood's standards, my reputation, all intertwined, all dependent on measured action. This wasn't just confrontation, it was strategy, and I was ready. I squared my shoulders, allowed a subtle smile to emerge, not of mockery, but of quiet assurance. The enforcer in crimson could attempt her theatrics, but she hadn't counted on an opponent who saw through smoke and mirrors, who knew the difference between real authority and performative power. And as I looked at her, clipboard raised, rigid posture, I asked aloud to the silent, watching neighbors, "Where are you watching from?" Inviting them into the tension, acknowledging that this was no longer just my fight, but a battle with implications for everyone standing behind the fences, waiting to see which way courage would tilt. The morning sun had barely cleared the horizon when I found myself pacing along the edge of my driveway, baby securely in a carrier, while Veronica Kemp, now fully the clipboard queen, hovered like a hawk, eyes scanning for any sign of defiance. She scribbled notes with exaggerated diligence, her heels clicking on the concrete in a rhythm meant to unsettle. Every motion, every glance from the enforcer in crimson was designed to assert dominance, to remind everyone that she believed the neighborhood bent to her whims. The surrounding residents had begun to peek from behind blinds and fences, their curiosity palpable, a silent jury witnessing this standoff. I knew her tactics. The tyrant in heels relied on intimidation, on psychological pressure, on making the ordinary seem extraordinary. Today it was the mere presence of my child on the driveway, a symbolic test she thought she could manipulate. I kept my gaze steady, breathing in the cool morning air tinged with freshly mown grass and the faint scent of morning dew. Each inhalation grounded me, a reminder that composure would be my ally far more than anger. The officer of rules thought she could fluster me, but experience had taught me the value of measured response. As she stepped closer, her shadow merging with mine, she spoke with the clipped precision of someone who believed power came from volume. "This property line violation cannot continue," she said, her voice cutting through the quiet suburban hum. "Immediate compliance is expected, or fines will be issued." Her words were sharp, legalistic, but hollow. I could see through them, the board chair in her mind, scripting each line as if it could bend reality, forgetting that facts, not intimidation, dictate true authority. I replied evenly, letting the calm weight of truth temper my voice. "The bylaws you cite don't cover this scenario," I said. "You're overstepping." Her lips pressed into a thin line, the clipboard queen pausing to reassess. The neighborhood had begun to stir, cars slowly rolling out of driveways, neighbors forming small clusters along the street. Each spectator's silent attention was like fuel to the escalating tension. I could sense the undercurrent of community opinion shifting. People weren't here for petty enforcement. They were here for fairness, for order rooted in law, not theatrics. The enforcer in crimson hadn't accounted for this collective scrutiny, a fact that became apparent in the tightening of her jaw and the barely perceptible backward step she took. I let a pause linger, long enough for the air to thrum with unspoken expectation. My voice cut through next, calm but sharp. "If your goal is safety, call the city inspectors. If it's intimidation, you'll fail." The tyrant in heels bristled visibly, scanning the empty stretch of street as if seeking reinforcements. I could see the internal conflict, the officer of rules wrestling with the reality that spectacle alone could not enforce authority here. Her fingers drummed on the clipboard, a rhythm of uncertainty breaking the narrative of control she'd been projecting. Every element of the morning seemed exaggerated, the distant hum of a lawnmower, the soft squeak of a swing in the nearby yard, the flutter of a newspaper caught by a stray breeze. It all conspired to heighten the suspense, to turn this mundane street into a stage for confrontation. And I realized, with a cold thrill of clarity, that the board chair's obsession with minor infractions had created an opportunity. By drawing attention to the absurdity of her enforcement, the neighborhood's eyes had become my allies, silently documenting, silently questioning, silently shifting allegiance. Finally, I spoke again, the weight of certainty in each word. "Your authority has limits, and today, those limits are on display." The clipboard queen froze for a moment, the enforcer in crimson battling to reclaim the illusion of control, but the calm I projected had already begun to unspool her narrative. Her pen hovered mid-air, unsure whether to continue the charade or retreat into scripted defenses. The spectators, silent yet palpable, seemed to sense the pivot, the moment when performance gives way to reality, and the tyrant in heels realizes the consequences of hubris. Even as she finally opened her mouth to respond, I felt the neighborhood shifting around us. The tension was electric, a prelude to the battle that had only just begun. The officer of rules would push, I knew, but now she would have to contend with the fact that her theatrics had drawn the community's attention, and that attention could be more powerful than any clipboard. By mid-morning, the tension on our street had thickened into a tangible presence. The enforcer in crimson, Veronica Kemp, had positioned herself near the community entrance, clipboard in hand, eyes darting from house to house. Every resident who stepped onto their porch was met with a stare that could pierce steel. She was calculating, her heels clicking a relentless rhythm across the pavement, as if each step laid down the rules themselves. The clipboard queen had perfected this performance over years, blending intimidation with procedural authority, but today, her audience was alert, skeptical, and restless. I stayed near my driveway, baby secure in my arms. sensing the subtle shifts in the neighborhood's mood. The board chair believed her mere presence could command compliance, but the officers of rules underestimated how quickly small cracks in authority could spread. I watched as she motioned for another resident to move a recycling bin that wasn't even obstructing anything, her obsession with control manifesting in petty enforcement. The tyrant in heels thrived on these micro-victories, but each minor overreach drew more attention, turning spectators into witnesses. I could feel the weight of eyes on both of us, neighbors whispering, questioning, judging. It was then that I noticed a figure standing slightly apart, hesitant, caught between loyalty and conscience. The conflicted witness, my next key ally, watched the unfolding drama with visible tension. Her fingers twisted a small notepad, her shoulders tensing as if every step the clipboard queen took threatened to crush her resolve. This internal struggle became evident in her fleeting glances, her stuttered movements, and the subtle furrowing of her brow. I recognized it immediately. Someone bound by past compliance, yet struggling with the ethical chasm Veronica had carved in the neighborhood. The enforcer in crimson, oblivious to the brewing internal rebellion, continued her rounds, each click of her heels punctuating the stifling tension. I took a deep breath, letting the silence expand, a prelude to action. The officer of rules had set the stage, her rigid enforcement inadvertently creating the conditions for exposure. I knew that the moment for strategic observation was fleeting. I moved slowly across the lawn, careful to appear casual, all while noting the patterns in Veronica Kemp's behavior. The board chair's arrogance revealed predictable rhythms, inspection routes, verbal cues, and the cadence of her authoritative voice. Every overreach was an opportunity, every unnecessary reprimand a thread in the unraveling tapestry of her control. A neighbor stepped forward, ostensibly to water a plant, but I saw the subtle nod, the first outward sign that the community's allegiance was not fixed. Veronica, the tyrant in heels, spotted the motion and straightened, tightening her posture as if preparing for confrontation. Her clipboard hovered like a shield. Her voice, when it came, was sharp and clipped, delivering a reprimand that carried no substance beyond intimidation. "Everyone must comply immediately," she declared, her gaze sweeping the small crowd. But the weight of collective scrutiny began to tilt the balance. The officer of rules realized her commands now echoed into skeptical ears, diminishing their power. I let a pause linger, the strategic silence echoing with unspoken consequence. The conflicted witness hesitated, glancing between the enforcer in crimson and me, her indecision almost tangible. The tension was a wire stretched taut, ready to snap at the right moment. I felt the undercurrent of potential alliance, the latent defiance waiting for permission to emerge. My presence, calm yet commanding, served as both catalyst and anchor. The clipboard queen, unaware, was walking into a subtle trap of perception. Her tyranny contrasted against reason, measured patience, and the community's quiet observance. Finally, I addressed the moment indirectly, projecting a sense of authority that didn't require aggression. "There's a difference between enforcement and fear," I said, my voice carrying over the still, attentive crowd. The tyrant in heels blinked, momentarily disrupted by the clarity of words that mirrored reality more than rulebooks. The conflicted witness shifted, a slight unguarded glance signaling the first step toward disclosure. Today was more than observation. It was preparation, the silent gathering of leverage that would later turn the tides against the board chair. By late afternoon, the tension on the street had thickened into a near-solid presence. The enforcer in crimson, Veronica Kemp, had stationed herself near the intersection, clipboard poised like a weapon, her heels clicking methodically against the pavement. Every glance she cast carried the weight of authority, and every reprimand she issued was precise, calibrated, meant to intimidate. The clipboard queen, as neighbors whispered, thrived on this performance. The tyrant in heels knew exactly how to make even small infractions feel catastrophic. But today, her usual air of dominance was challenged by the quiet watchfulness of those she sought to control. I stayed near my garage, monitoring the flow of her inspections, the cadence of her authoritarian steps. The board chair had an almost ritualistic pattern. She approached each yard with meticulous scrutiny, scrutinizing mailboxes, landscaping, even the alignment of garden decorations. Yet, in her obsession with order, she left subtle gaps, small errors in her own execution, tiny violations of procedure that an observant mind could exploit. Each time she stopped, I noted her focus, the way the officer of rules would lean in to emphasize her authority, inadvertently exposing her predictability. A neighbor emerged from behind a hedge, hesitating, then quietly signaling toward the conflicted witness. The individual's body language was telling, shoulders hunched, hands twisting a notepad nervously, eyes darting between the clipboard queen and me. This was no longer passive observation. The internal struggle was palpable. The conflicted witness wanted to act, but feared reprisal. The tyrant in heels had instilled this tension masterfully, conditioning neighbors to comply out of fear rather than reason. Yet, even the most controlled systems contain fissures. And this hesitation was a crack in the armor. I adjusted my stance, stepping just enough into view to assert subtle dominance without appearing confrontational. The enforcer in crimson noticed, her gaze flicking toward me, sharp and deliberate. Veronica Kemp, with all her poise and performance, couldn't yet gauge the depth of quiet resistance forming around her. The officer of rules seemed impatient, ready to intervene, but the energy in the neighborhood had shifted imperceptibly. Her weekly reign of intimidation was losing its absolute grip. The collective observation had created an unseen tension. Suddenly, Veronica Kemp marched toward a neighbor who had merely left a hose running. "That's a violation!" the board chair barked, clipboard raised like a scepter. The overreach was dramatic, drawing attention rather than submission. The tyrant in heels believed spectacle strengthened control, but it instead created spectators. I noticed subtle glances exchanged, nods barely restrained. The conflicted witness stepped slightly forward, a trembling hand brushing the notebook, contemplating a choice that could pivot the entire situation. Fear and curiosity intertwined, the officer of rules unaware that this microdrama was building towards something much larger. I leaned on my knowledge of procedure and psychology, remaining calm yet deliberate. The board chair had built her identity around dominance, yet she had ignored one principle: overextension leads to vulnerability. The enforcer in crimson became predictable in her patterns. The clipboard queen's confidence blinded her to nuance. By documenting her movements mentally, I was creating the architecture for strategic action. Each overreach, each unnecessary reprimand, fed into the eventual exposure, and the conflicted witness's observation meant the truth had a silent messenger ready to speak. The neighborhood's energy subtly shifted. Conversations held in hushed tones, eyes lingering on the clipboard queen. The tyrant in heels grew more forceful, attempting to reassert control, but the effect was diminishing. The officer of rules, unaware of the silent network forming around her, repeated her patrols with mechanical precision. I could feel the pulse of collective awareness, the small stirrings of defiance that would later become pivotal. Today, no overt confrontation had occurred, yet the stage had been set. Observation, patience, and subtle influence were slowly unraveling the board chair's grip, preparing for a decisive moment that would turn the tables. The morning haze had barely lifted when the enforcer in crimson, Veronica Kemp, reappeared, clipboard in hand, a practiced smirk playing across her lips. The board chair had a ritual for these mornings. She'd check the mailboxes, scan the alignment of hedges, and hover over every decorative object that dared to stray from her rigid vision. Today, however, her routine would collide with careful observation, and the officer of rules was about to face consequences she hadn't anticipated. Even the clipboard queen, for all her poise, was unknowingly leading herself into a trap that the neighborhood had been quietly constructing. I watched from the corner of my driveway, noting each step, each pause, each flicker of her gaze. The tyrant in heels exuded confidence, but confidence had a pattern, and patterns can be exploited. Veronica Kemp was meticulous in her inspections, yet every overzealous move she made left a breadcrumb trail. The residents, previously silent under the weight of the clipboard queen's authority, began to exchange glances, their discomfort subtle but unmistakable. The enforcer in crimson, unaware of the growing tension, continued her rounds, unknowingly sowing the seeds of her own undoing. A young couple approached, whispering about a past reprimand for a minor shrub misalignment. They hesitated, but eventually pointed toward a small breach in the HOA's own protocol, an unapproved adjustment the board chair had permitted in another section of the neighborhood. I leaned closer, absorbing the murmurs, understanding that these tiny cracks could be built into a full-scale revelation. The tyrant in heels, always fixated on perceived disorder, hadn't realized that her obsession with control had left vulnerabilities ripe for exposure. Each neighbor's recollection added another layer to the map I was quietly constructing. Veronica Kemp paused at a driveway, her clipboard tilted as she scribbled notes, the enforcer and crimson persona fully engaged. I could see the tension in her shoulders, the slight rigidity in her posture, as she corrected a mailbox alignment that no one else had noticed. The officer of rules thrived on minutia, believing precision equaled power, but in reality, obsession could blind a person to the strategic landscape forming around them. Even the clipboard queen, in her singular focus, underestimated the growing network of silent observers ready to act when the moment was right. From behind the corner, the conflicted witness shifted uneasily, eyes darting between me and the clipboard queen. Hesitation betrayed internal conflict. Should they speak up or remain silent to protect themselves? The tyrant in heels never noticed the small, almost imperceptible movements, the micro-alliances forming among the residents. Yet this witness was crucial. Their eventual testimony would provide validation, evidence, and context for every procedural misstep Veronica Kemp had ever committed. The enforcer in crimson was strong, methodical, and confident, but she hadn't accounted for the human element, the subtle shift in collective courage. I stepped forward slightly, ensuring that my presence was noted without appearing confrontational. The board chair looked my way, eyes narrowing, assessing whether I posed a threat. The officer of rules had built her empire on intimidation, assuming compliance, but the air was shifting. Each overreach, each hyper-focus on trivial details was a thread I intended to pull. The clipboard queen's predictable tactics would be her undoing. My knowledge of procedure and strategic planning allowed me to remain unseen, yet fully aware of the narrative unfolding. Her own rigidity had become the roadmap for her eventual exposure. The morning progressed with a series of small confrontations. Veronica Kemp chastising a misaligned garden ornament, the enforcer in crimson lecturing a neighbor on hedge height. Each interaction, while appearing normal to the casual observer, was feeding the dossier of patterns, weaknesses, and predictable reactions. I made mental notes, aligning them with what the conflicted witness had whispered earlier. The tyrant in heels, blind to the mounting silent opposition, had no idea how dangerously close she was to a strategic trap. And when the time came, these subtle, deliberate observations would catalyze the first major turning point in our neighborhood's quiet rebellion. The sun had barely crested the horizon when the enforcer in crimson, Veronica Kemp, appeared again, her heels clicking against the cobblestone like a metronome counting down to chaos. The clipboard queen's morning inspections had become ritualistic, predictable, and ripe for exploitation. Today, the board chair's overconfidence would be her undoing, and the officer of rules had no inkling of the meticulous planning unfolding just beyond her line of sight. Every rigid step, every tilted note on her clipboard broadcasted exactly what she wanted to hide. Her obsession with control made her vulnerable. I observed from the shadows of my porch, my senses heightened, remembering every past encounter. The tyrant in heels moved with authority, yet there was an unmistakable rigidity in her posture, a subtle hesitance whenever she approached the newly laid flower beds or uneven fence lines. Veronica Kemp believed the power of intimidation was absolute, but intimidation can be quantified, mapped, and ultimately dismantled. Each small reaction, each frown or pointed finger became a piece of evidence, a puzzle only visible to those who had learned to watch, to wait, and to act when the time was right. Neighbors began emerging cautiously, whispering about previous grievances. Fine unjustly levied for a paint color, a hedge trimmed too short, a mailbox polished to the wrong sheen. The enforcer in crimson, focused solely on her checklist, didn't notice the network forming around her. The clipboard queen had underestimated the quiet simmer of frustration building behind closed doors, and the officer of rules was completely unaware of the conflicted witness observing every motion. This witness, hesitant, cautious, yet increasingly resolute, was beginning to understand the magnitude of the board chair's overreach and the strategic advantage that careful documentation could yield. I shifted closer to the edge of the street, keeping my presence discreet but intentional. The tyrant in heels paused mid-step, glancing at me, suspicion flickering across her face. Veronica Kemp's overconfidence made her predictable, and predictability is exploitable. Every correction she issued, every admonishment for an inconsequential detail, became a stepping stone toward the exposure of her mismanagement. The clipboard queen believed compliance was universal, but the undercurrent of dissent, carefully nurtured, was stronger than she could ever anticipate. Across the cul-de-sac, the conflicted witness flinched as the officer of rules reprimanded a neighbor for misaligned garden stones. Their eyes darted toward me, a silent acknowledgement that change was possible. The board chair's obsession with minute details had blinded her to human patterns, the subtle alliances forming, the whispered observations shared, and the careful documentation of overreach. Veronica Kemp, for all her meticulousness, had created a latticework of vulnerabilities that, if properly leveraged, would ensure her authority was permanently checked. I made mental notes of every infraction, every overzealous adjustment. The enforcer in crimson had no idea that the landscape she sought to control was, in fact, shaping the blueprint for her eventual downfall. The clipboard queen's meticulous records would serve as her own undoing when juxtaposed with the witness accounts, photographs, and evidence collected by the neighborhood, quietly aligning behind me. The tyrant in heels remained unaware that every demand, every minor punishment, had been logged and analyzed. By late morning, Veronica Kemp's energy began to waver. The officer of rules had successfully maintained an image of unwavering dominance, yet cracks were appearing in her carefully curated veneer. Residents exchanged glances, subtly signaling that the time for quiet endurance was ending. Even the conflicted witness, previously hesitant, now understood their role: validation, corroboration, and exposure. Every interaction, every rigid stance, and every overstep by the board chair fed into the larger strategy, preparing the stage for the first decisive confrontation. The day's inspections concluded, but the ripple effect had begun. The enforcer in crimson believed she had asserted control, yet the undercurrents of resistance were solidifying into strategy. The clipboard queen had unknowingly paved the path for accountability, and I, watching from my vantage point, felt the satisfaction of careful preparation, knowing that the tyrant in heels would soon face consequences crafted from her own predictable, obsessive actions. Victory was no longer a hope. It was becoming an inevitability. The neighborhood had grown quiet, almost tense, as though the air itself anticipated a storm. The enforcer in crimson, Veronica Kemp, strutted along the freshly paved sidewalk, her clipboard clutched like a weapon, eyes scanning for imperfections only she seemed to see. The board chair had perfected her performance of authority, yet she remained oblivious to the subtle dynamics shifting beneath her gaze. The clipboard queen believed compliance would never fail her, but this day would expose cracks she hadn't foreseen. From my vantage point, I could see the officer of rules tightening, brow furrowed, as if sensing the impending unraveling of her constructed order. It was time. The conflicted witness, someone who had long feared reprisal but understood the magnitude of what they knew, approached cautiously. Their movements were tentative, yet resolute, the perfect combination for covert revelation. I had spent weeks gaining their trust, demonstrating that alignment with truth, not fear, could yield justice. As they approached, the clipboard queen lifted her head, scanning the cul-de-sac, unaware that the tyrant in heels was about to receive the first blow from an unseen hand. Veronica Kemp, absorbed in her self-importance, hadn't noticed the silent alignment forming in the shadows, ready to strike at her unearned authority. The conflicted witness leaned close, whispering details that confirmed everything we suspected about the board chair: misappropriations, overreaches, and unjustified punishments, all meticulously documented by the witness's discreet observations. The officer of rules overconfidence had left her exposed, and every whispered confirmation strengthened the foundation of the neighborhood's quiet rebellion. The enforcer in crimson believed her control absolute, yet the evidence, combined with witness corroboration, created a lattice of accountability that would be impossible to ignore. The clipboard queen's overreach, intended to intimidate, had inadvertently mobilized the very resistance she had sought to suppress. Veronica Kemp moved further down the street, inspecting a neighbor's freshly trimmed hedge. The tyrant in heels had no idea that the conflicted witness was feeding information directly into the strategic plan forming behind closed doors. Every action the enforcer in crimson took now became fodder for the eventual confrontation. The board chair's meticulous obsession with minor infractions, once a source of fear, was now a roadmap for her undoing. Each overzealous note, each reprimand, each pointed glare was carefully noted and stored in memory, ready to be deployed at the precise moment. I glanced at the witness, who nodded subtly, signaling readiness. Their fear had been replaced by determination, a quiet fire ignited by the realization that complicity was optional. The officer of rules' arrogance had blinded her to the consequences of her actions, and now, with the witness's testimony in hand, we had a tangible path forward. The clipboard queen believed she had isolated herself from accountability, but every misstep, every exaggerated enforcement had been observed, cataloged, and understood. Veronica Kemp's reign of minor terror was on the cusp of exposure. As the sun climbed higher, the neighborhood seemed to breathe in tandem with us, the collective anticipation almost palpable. The conflicted witness, previously hesitant, now walked with quiet confidence, revealing what they had seen to me in fragments. These pieces, scattered across the block, yet coherently connected, would soon form a narrative undeniable in its clarity. The enforcer in crimson remained unaware, focused solely on surface appearances, while the board chair's grip on control began to loosen, bit by bit, with each subtle revelation. By late morning, the groundwork for the counterplan was complete. The clipboard queen, for all her meticulousness, had sown the seeds of her own exposure. The officer of rules continued her inspections, oblivious to the fact that the conflicted witness had become an active participant in the unraveling. Veronica Kemp, in her usual display of authority, had unwittingly set the stage for a confrontation orchestrated with precision, patience, and unerring logic. The moment of truth was approaching, and the neighborhood, once subdued, was ready to witness the first signs of the tyrant in heel's downfall. The morning air felt thick with anticipation as I watched the enforcer in crimson, Veronica Kemp, stride purposefully toward the cul-de-sac, clipboard tucked tightly under her arm. The board chair had grown more relentless with each passing day, issuing arbitrary fines and scrutinizing every detail of our properties, as if perfection itself were enforceable by decree. The clipboard queen's steps were deliberate, measured, a rhythm meant to assert dominance. But this time, she was stepping into a carefully constructed trap. Her authority had lulled her into complacency, unaware that the neighborhood's tide was quietly shifting, guided by careful observation and a strategic hand. I crouched behind a neatly trimmed hedge, surveying the scene as the officer of rules continued her rounds. Every glance, every note scribbled on that clipboard, fed into the web we had been weaving for weeks. The tyrant in heels, so focused on maintaining an image of control, didn't notice the subtle glances exchanged between neighbors, the whispered conversations, the quiet signals of alliance forming behind her back. Veronica Kemp believed the board. Chair's power was absolute, but each overreach, each petty violation she enforced, was slowly unraveling the narrative she had so carefully constructed. From my vantage point, I could see the conflicted witness approach cautiously, shoulders tense yet determined. Their earlier hesitance had transformed into resolve, now offering critical insights into the enforcer in crimson's behaviors. Every unlawful threat, every procedural error observed by the witness was being quietly documented. The clipboard queen had unknowingly created a roadmap to her own undoing, each step meticulously traced by eyes that now understood the pattern. The officer of rules, oblivious to the scrutiny, continued to assert dominance, unaware that the neighborhood had begun mobilizing against her arbitrary reign. Veronica Kemp paused mid-stride to inspect a neighbor's mailbox, her gaze sharp, exacting. The board chair's obsession with control had blinded her to the subtle alignments forming against her. The tyrant in heels believed fear was her most potent weapon, yet it was curiosity and calculated observation that had now become the community's edge. I could see the conflicted witness signal a neighbor discreetly, sharing a small but crucial piece of information about how the enforcer in crimson had manipulated board procedures. Every secret revealed was a small victory, turning the clipboard queen's own meticulousness into evidence of misconduct. The officer of rules adjusted her stance, tapping the clipboard against her leg, unaware of the silent coordination unfolding around her. Each neighbor, once cowed by the board chair's authority, now displayed subtle acts of defiance, a window left open to observe, a door slightly ajar to catch the enforcer in crimson in the act of overreach. Veronica Kemp, engrossed in her inspection, failed to notice the growing network of eyes silently recording, analyzing, and preparing for the inevitable confrontation. The clipboard queen's tyranny had underestimated the very people she sought to control. I signaled to the conflicted witness, who moved with newfound purpose, revealing an overlooked irregularity in the Officer of Rules Enforcement, a procedural violation that would form the foundation of our strategy. The enforcer in crimson, so confident in her authority, didn't see the trap taking shape. The board chair's obsession with detail, which had once been a source of intimidation, now provided the leverage we needed. Each minor overreach was a thread in the fabric of her exposure, ready to unravel when the moment arrived. By late afternoon, the plan for the neighborhood's pushback was almost complete. The tyrant in heels remained focused on superficial order, blind to the complex, strategic network now aligned against her. Veronica Kemp, the enforcer in crimson, the clipboard queen, all were walking a path that had been quietly prepared, step by step, by eyes and minds attuned to justice rather than fear. The Officer of Rules' reign of intimidation was on the verge of collapsing, and the stage was set for the next decisive act in the neighborhood's fight for fairness. The morning sun glinted off the asphalt as the board chair, Veronica Kemp, strutted down the street with the confidence of someone convinced her power was unshakable. The enforcer in crimson paused to tap her clipboard, a subtle signal of control, her heels clicking against the pavement like a metronome of authority. She had no idea that every step she took was being silently logged by neighbors who had long learned the patterns of her tyranny. The clipboard queen believed in intimidation, but what she failed to notice was the meticulous counter-strategy unfolding beneath her radar, fueled by observation, patience, and quiet alliances. I leaned against the stone wall at the corner, watching the tyrant in heels inspect each driveway, her eyes scanning for imperfection, her body rigid, posture sharp. Each note she scribbled was a testament to her obsession with control, yet it also provided the blueprint we needed. The Officer of Rules, so focused on minutiae, never realized that her obsession with procedure had become our weapon. I could see the conflicted witness moving carefully among the neighbors, signaling discreetly, sharing critical information about the board chair's unilateral actions. Every whisper of procedural abuse added to the growing dossier of her mismanagement. Veronica Kemp stopped abruptly at a freshly installed garden fountain, frowning as she read the engraved plaque declaring it compliant with the new city guidelines. The enforcer in crimson had intended this moment to reinforce authority, but instead it revealed the depth of her ignorance about actual regulations. The clipboard queen's insistence on arbitrary interpretations made it easier for us to anticipate her next move. The tyrant in heels, so confident in her self-perceived omnipotence, had underestimated the collective resolve of the neighborhood. Her focus on minor infractions had created cracks wide enough to exploit strategically. From my vantage point, I watched as the Officer of Rules approached a neighbor's hedge, measuring and noting violations that weren't there. The board chair's methods were precise but predictable. The conflicted witness nodded subtly to me, indicating the next critical observation. A violation notice left unsigned, a procedure skipped, an overreach documented without quorum. Every detail of the clipboard queen's overzealousness became another thread in the tapestry of her undoing. The tyrant in heels was walking blind into a scenario that had been mapped by patient, calculated observation. As Veronica Kemp turned toward the cul-de-sac, the enforcer in crimson's movements revealed a growing tension, small hesitations, a flicker of doubt in her eyes. The Officer of Rules was beginning to realize, subconsciously, that her dominance was being challenged. Each neighbor's quiet coordination added to the mounting pressure, a silent rebellion taking shape around her. The board chair's obsession with minute details, once a source of fear, now worked against her. Her tyranny was predictable, her arrogance exploitable, and the stage was set for a strategic collapse. The conflicted witness discreetly passed along a final piece of intelligence, pointing out where the clipboard queen had violated HOA procedures and local ordinances. The enforcer in crimson, still unaware, continued her rounds, oblivious to the impending confrontation. The tyrant in heels' perception of control was about to meet the methodical reality of evidence, planning, and community coordination. Veronica Kemp, the officer of rules, the clipboard queen, they were about to discover that intimidation alone could not withstand a carefully constructed strategy rooted in legality, observation, and neighborly unity. By mid-afternoon, the preparation was nearly complete. Every recorded overreach, every procedural error, every subtle sign of vulnerability in the board chair's execution had been noted. The enforcer in crimson, the tyrant in heels, the officer of rules, they had set themselves on a path that led directly to accountability. Our network, built on patience and meticulous attention, was ready to execute the next phase. Veronica Kemp would soon face the consequences of underestimating the very people she sought to control, and the neighborhood's quiet rebellion was poised to make itself known. The air was thick with tension as the board chair, Veronica Kemp, arrived at the community center, her heels echoing against the polished floors. The enforcer in crimson clutched her clipboard tightly, a faint tremor betraying the meticulous control she usually wielded effortlessly. The clipboard queen had expected compliance, obedience, even fear, but instead she was met with focused eyes, calm determination, and the subtle, strategic placement of every neighbor who had been quietly rallied over the past weeks. The tyrant in heels believed her authority was absolute, but this gathering would reveal just how fragile her control had become. I moved through the crowd, observing the officer of rules as she hovered near the back, notes and cameras ready. Each detail recorded, each reaction measured, contributed to the unfolding strategy. Veronica Kemp glanced over her shoulder, scanning for any sign of dissent, unaware that nearly every face in the room held the same quiet, resolute determination. The board chair's usual smirk of superiority faltered for the first time. The enforcer in crimson sensed the shift, even if she couldn't yet define its source. The clipboard queen was about to discover that predictability could be weaponized against her. From the front row, the conflicted witness whispered a last-minute correction to our positioning. Every neighbor in attendance had been strategically placed, ensuring that the board chair could no longer manipulate the room with visual intimidation alone. The tyrant in heels' eyes darted nervously, a subtle acknowledgement of the invisible trap being sprung. The officer of rules watched as Veronica Kemp prepared to speak, unaware that her every gesture, every word, was being contrasted with evidence collected meticulously from months of overreach. The board chair began her customary speech, emphasizing rules, order, and the dangers of noncompliance, her voice sharp and commanding. The enforcer in crimson read along, referencing the bylaws she had memorized, believing this recital would intimidate the gathered crowd. But the clipboard queen was met with a silent wall of resolve. The neighbors had learned the pattern of her overreach and were ready to expose every procedural flaw. Each statement, each threat, was now countered by facts and community awareness. The tyrant in heels had misjudged the situation entirely. I stepped forward, voice calm but carrying across the room. The officer of rules straightened, cameras and notes poised to document every reaction. Veronica Kemp froze, the board chair's confidence cracking as I highlighted discrepancies, procedural errors, and violations that had gone unnoticed, until now. The enforcer in crimson realized that her meticulous enforcement had inadvertently provided the blueprint for accountability. The clipboard queen's hands tightened around the papers she had intended to intimidate with, but they now served as evidence of her own missteps. The conflicted witness emerged from the back, providing corroboration of what had been observed, a final piece that linked every misstep into an undeniable chain. The tyrant in heels tried to interject, but each argument was met with calmly presented facts. Veronica Kemp's expression shifted, her board chair persona fading as the room collectively acknowledged the evidence. The enforcer in crimson, the clipboard queen, the officer of rules, all saw that control had slipped, that authority alone could not withstand transparency and unity. By the time the room quieted, the strategy had worked flawlessly. Every procedural error, every overreach, every attempt at intimidation had been documented, presented, and understood by the community. The board chair, Veronica Kemp, looked around, realizing that the power she had relied on so heavily had been neutralized by preparation, observation, and careful orchestration. The tyrant in heels could only stand in disbelief as the weight of her miscalculations became apparent. The stage was set for the final confrontation, the vote, the revelation of accountability. The enforcer in crimson, the officer of rules, and the clipboard queen had unwittingly contributed to their own unraveling, and the community had quietly, methodically seized control. Veronica Kemp, the board chair, had met her match, not with rage, but with planning, patience, and undeniable evidence that could not be ignored. The battle, lines were drawn, and the next moves would determine the neighborhood's future. The community hall buzzed with tension, the faint hum of fluorescent lights echoing off the walls as the board chair, Veronica Kemp, took her usual place at the head of the table. The enforcer in crimson was perched nearby, clipboard in hand, eyes scanning every corner of the room, expecting obedience, fear, and submission. The clipboard queen, ever meticulous, adjusted her notes and projected the air of control she usually commanded. But today was different. The tyrant in heels would soon realize that the neighborhood had shifted. The officer of rules might still follow protocol, but the room was no longer hers to dominate. I stood at the back, surveying the assembly of neighbors. Each seat was filled strategically, each face resolute, yet calm. The conflicted witness, whose presence had been quietly reassuring all week, leaned subtly toward me, confirming our final alignment. Veronica Kemp's gaze swept across the crowd, a faint smirk forming as she assumed her customary superiority would cow the attendees. The board chair believed the rules were weapons in her hands. The enforcer in crimson, confident in her memorized bylaws, was ready to back her up. The clipboard queen's posture screamed authority. The tyrant in heels was poised to pounce, but no one had accounted for the strategy that had been silently taking shape. As the meeting commenced, the board chair launched into her routine speech, outlining rules, policies, and the perceived consequences of disobedience. Her voice was sharp, clipped, commanding attention with the habitual precision she wielded like a scalpel. The enforcer in crimson nodded along, each annotation a subtle reinforcement of authority. The clipboard queen projected meticulous control, scanning the room for signs of dissent. The tyrant in heels exuded confidence, ready to enforce compliance. But beneath the surface, the community's unity was unshakable, and the officer of rules noticed subtle signs of resistance forming. I stepped forward, calm but firm, interrupting the rhythm of the board chair's speech with a quiet authority that carried across the room. Each neighbor's eyes met mine, sharing the understanding that this moment had been carefully orchestrated. Veronica Kemp's smirk faltered slightly. The board chair did not anticipate the quiet confidence radiating from the room's back row. The enforcer in crimson and the clipboard queen glanced nervously at one another as the first threads of the plan began to unravel. The tyrant in heels tightened her grip on the papers, sensing a shift that her control could no longer counterbalance. Evidence was presented methodically, each procedural error, each overreach, each violation highlighted with precision. The board chair struggled to interject, her voice now faltering, the enforcer in crimson stammering as discrepancies were revealed. The clipboard queen tried to maintain composure, but the tyrant in heels could not hide the realization that authority alone was no longer enough. The officer of rules observed silently, aware that their usual leverage had been neutralized by collective preparation and undeniable facts. Neighbors shared brief testimonials, their voices steady and factual, each story amplifying the documented evidence of mismanagement and abuse. Veronica Kemp, the board chair, blinked in disbelief as the officer of rules recorded each statement, the enforcer in crimson quietly acknowledging the gravity of the exposure. The clipboard queen's hands tightened around her notes, knowing her meticulous preparation had been co-opted by the strategic alignment of community members. The tyrant in heels shifted uneasily, realizing that the balance of power had irrevocably tipped. By the meeting's midpoint, the board chair's authority had collapsed under scrutiny. Each error, each overreach, and each procedural misstep was laid bare, leaving the enforcer in crimson, the clipboard queen, and the tyrant in heels powerless to counteract the tide of accountability. The conflicted witness offered quiet corroboration, reinforcing the chain of evidence with a subtle yet undeniable impact. The officer of rules watched as the neighborhood's unity transformed into action, the room itself becoming a stage for justice. When the final vote was called, the community's support was overwhelming. Veronica Kemp, the board chair, had been exposed, her control dismantled by strategy, evidence, and collective resolve. The enforcer in crimson, the clipboard queen, and the tyrant in heels could only watch as their former authority crumbled under the weight of transparency and unity. The officer of rules noted the decisive outcome, witnessing the shift from tyranny to community-led resolution. The room had changed. The board chair, Veronica Kemp, once towering in her authority, now sat quietly in the corner, a flicker of disbelief in her eyes. The enforcer in crimson shuffled papers nervously. The clipboard queen adjusted her notes as if hoping that meticulous organization could somehow restore the control they had lost. The tyrant in heels had straightened herself one last time, but the weight of inevitability pressed down, leaving her posture stiff and hollow. Even the officer of rules, who had always maintained a watchful neutrality, observed the aftermath with a sense of cautious respect. The neighborhood had claimed its victory, not with violence or anger, but with strategy, preparation, and unwavering determination. I stood before the community, the quiet satisfaction of success coursing through me. Each neighbor around me shared that sense of triumph, eyes bright with relief and vindication. The board chair, despite her fall, remained part of the community, her presence a reminder that even those who enforce rules with rigidity could be held accountable. The enforcer in crimson, the clipboard queen, and the tyrant in heels now understood that authority alone could not override collective action, grounded in legality and fairness. The officer of rules took note, witnessing firsthand that the balance of power had shifted permanently. The final documents were signed, filed, and verified. Every procedural violation, every bypassed protocol, and every act of overreach by Veronica Kemp had been recorded and addressed. The community's voice was undeniable. The board chair could no longer manipulate bylaws or intimidate neighbors. Her empire of control had been dismantled, quietly but decisively. The enforcer in crimson and the clipboard queen had no choice but to accept the outcome, realizing that the meticulous rules they so revered had been wielded in a new way, by the very people they were meant to serve. As I walked through the neighborhood that evening, the weight of weeks of planning and tension lifted. The sound of children playing, the soft rustle of leaves in the warm breeze, the faint aroma of evening dinners, all of it felt like a subtle celebration of regained harmony. The tyrant in heels lingered near the edge of the park, watching the community resume its natural rhythm, a silent acknowledgement that control could not be forced when collective insight and action prevailed. Even the officer of rules offered a respectful nod, recognizing that the system had worked as intended when guided by those who understood its foundations. The conflicted witness approached, a quiet smile confirming the relief and satisfaction that had taken root. Their support had been crucial, and the courage to speak truth quietly had tipped the balance. The board chair, Veronica Kemp, lingered in the background, absorbing the lesson that power derived from fear and manipulation is always temporary. The enforcer in crimson, the clipboard queen, and the tyrant in heels had learned that legitimacy and respect cannot be demanded. They must be earned. The officer of rules stood back, cataloging the experience as a precedent for future accountability. As neighbors exchanged nods and congratulations, I reflected on the path we had taken. This was not just about one tyrant or one HOA. It was a lesson in vigilance, strategy, and unity. The board chair, once untouchable, had been checked not through confrontation alone, but through methodical planning, legal precision, and communal solidarity. The enforcer in crimson, the clipboard queen, and the tyrant in heels were part of a broader understanding now. Rules serve communities, not rulers. The officer of rules had seen it clearly. The people had regained their voice. And in that quiet, restored normalcy, I looked at the neighborhood, at the faces of those who had stood with me. A subtle, powerful victory had been claimed, one that would resonate for years to come. The board chair, Veronica Kemp, would return to her home understanding that authority without accountability is meaningless. The enforcer in crimson, the clipboard queen, the tyrant in heels, and even the officer of rules had all witnessed the transformation. It was a triumph measured not in anger, but in justice and strategy. If you want more stories of homeowners standing up to HOA tyranny, hit subscribe right now, share your story in the comments, and let me know where you're watching from.